So the last subject that we talked about is probably for most of us a little bit more theoretical. It's applicable to us in this day and age because it's part of what our culture needs to hear. We're grappling with what men and women are, and Jesus says, from the beginning, this is the way that it was. You're a man from the beginning, you're a woman from the beginning, this is what marriage looks like. And so it answers a lot of cultural questions that we have to have rock solid in our minds as we go forward with our culture, but it's still somewhat theoretical. It doesn't affect us on a daily basis, most of us, how we're actually living. We're not making decisions about divorce on a daily basis, so it is a little bit out there. But this next one, where Jesus follows the same formula, it hits home a lot closer, I think, than the other one does. Beginning in verse 33 of Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." What Jesus, let's take it in the two parts. First, when you hear what he's addressing here, where he says, "You have heard that it was said of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord." Do you have any problems with that saying as it stands? Get some feedback here. And the yes or no questions are a little bit hard, but maybe. By the way, it was really fun in Good News Club while you guys are thinking about that, because whenever the kids had absolutely no idea, they were saying, "God, Jesus." So when I say God, you really hear it. But then we also had one kid raise her hand and say, "So since God knew that people were going to sin in advance, why did he create people? Because in a sense, wasn't he creating sin?" And so we also had that one in the midst of everything, which was fun. And the lady who was teaching at that moment, she took a couple swings at it and then said, "I've got pastors in the room, guys." And so that's how that conversation went. But so as it stands here, Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord.'" He's going to come back and say differently, but how does that strike you? For me, I oftentimes, when I hear what Jesus responds to, I'm like, yeah, that's what's wrong with that? Is that what you're thinking as you're hearing that?
Well, if people make an oath and they bring the Lord's name in it, they're assuming that the Lord is, the Lord should be in agreement with them making that oath, and it's not necessarily so.
Okay. So perhaps they're going to run into a problem where they lightly attach God's name to something, like we do when we pray in Jesus' name, where we pray something that has all to do with our creature comforts and then say, "And may the authority of Jesus Christ be on this request." Maybe that's some of the same thing. Tom?
It's hard to separate it from the context of them making an oath, but it sounds like the original commandment is just do what you say you're going to do.
Okay. So the original command might be, do what you say you're going to do. I would say that's the proposition of this lesson tonight, is do what you say you're going to do. Now, Jesus is going to say, do what you say you're going to do without making an oath about it. But he also says, for to use an oath is of the evil one. We're going to have to think through all of this. We are also going to have to put in some historical context in order to understand where Jesus is going with this. And so let's think back into the Old Testament. I'll get some readers for some of this so that it's not my voice throughout the whole thing. Could I have somebody read Leviticus 19:12? Because as Jesus is referencing what the people had said, they were basing the rules that they were basing, that he's going to confront, on a smattering of verses from the Old Testament. So we're going to look at the smattering, and it's kind of a conglomeration of them. So Leviticus 19:12, Coral will read that. Numbers 30, verse 2. Will someone read that? Tom? And then Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23. That's a longer section there, but will someone take that? Yeah, it'll be Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23. And we'll take just those three. We could also, you can think back into the Ten Commandments. You have number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And also number 9, you shall not bear false witness. And I usually cover my mouth so I mumble on it. But number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That definitely affects this. And also you shall not bear false witness. That also plays into this. But Leviticus 19:12, Coral.
You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord.
All right, right before we get to Numbers 32, I will, chapter 30, verse 2, I'll just point this out about that verse. Notice what it, if you caught it as it went by, what happens when you swear by God's name falsely? You're profaning his name. What does it mean to profane his name? Okay, to take it in vain. Good. Anybody want to elaborate on that a little bit? We talk about profanity, but what is profanity really, Tom?
To soil it.
Okay, to soil it. Definitely, it could be to soil it. So picture a really muddy day, and you've got some object that you were wanting to keep nice and pristine, and you drop it in the mud. It could be that. But profanity is actually just taking something and making it common. Household use. So household use that you don't think anything about it. Don't you love this cup? I have very nostalgic feelings about this cup. Actually, I have no feelings about this cup whatsoever. It's profane in the sense of it's very common, very ordinary. And there are some things that must never become common or ordinary. One thing I've noticed about profanity is people go to the extreme in their language and then they're stuck. And so then they just keep throwing it into conversations. So I hear people walking down the sidewalk and teens throwing out every word that they can think of, which is like 2. They've got basically 2 words that they can add to everything, so it no longer means anything. And it's almost not offensive anymore. You just think, wow, can't you be any more creative than that? What you just said is no longer shocking. It's just blah, nothingness. And so that's what God is talking about in Leviticus 19:12. When you swear by his name falsely and you're just attaching his name to things, then it's making it common, ordinary, throwaway. Yeah, John?
Well, God's not common and it's not ordinary.
Right.
And
So that's where the rub is. If like Jonah, that struck me so much when we were going through Jonah this time. Jonah, why are you running to the ends of the earth? It's because I fear the God of heaven and earth. You fear him, so you're running from him. How does this make sense? There's a disconnect between what you're saying and what you're doing. And God is saying he's not common or ordinary. I saw a hand in the back. Coral, was that you?
I did a cross-reference here, and the word despised is often used together with profane.
Yep. And to despise means to think little of and just to look down on. And God's name must be held up as holy, and we must not profane it.
Sorry, defile, not despise.
Okay, defile. So yes, again, there is that idea to the name of muddying it. And if you do apply it to something that you're not going to keep, that would defile it. But sometimes when it's used, it's just simply making it common in household. All right, Numbers 30, verse 2.
If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth.
All right. And so if you were to read down through the rest of the chapter, you would see that if you are a responsible adult male, you get to decide whether or not you're going to make a vow in the name of the Lord or not. But once you do, you cannot go back on it. If you are an adult female, a woman, if you're not married, so you're still living in your dad's house, and your dad overhears the vow that you made to the Lord, and he doesn't have any objection to it, then you're required to keep it. If you are a married woman and your husband hears your vow, he doesn't object to it, then you're required to keep it, and on down the line. There are different rules for it, but still, notice what the rules are about. You are making a vow to the Lord and swearing an oath to bind yourself by some agreement. Think back to Matthew 5 for just a moment. Jesus says, and I'll reread it in case you're not there, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. These are rules, a whole chapter of rules about how you make oaths to the Lord. And sure, you're not supposed to keep them falsely, but he's going to confront both halves of that. Not just the false oaths, but making oaths, period, he's going to confront. Just thought I'd throw that out right now. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 through 23.
When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sin to you. That which is gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vow to the Lord your God what you have promised with your lips.
All right, again, rules about vowing. You don't have to vow. You don't have to say you're going to do it. But once you do, you have to follow through on it. Those are some of the Old Testament principles regarding the statement. And if you can come back to Matthew chapter 5 now. Relook at what Jesus has said about these. He says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Again, especially when I look through the Old Testament passages regarding it, it's like, yeah, that's what I think I'm hearing. And as far as it goes, there's nothing wrong with the way that it stands. But remember, Jesus is going to be taking what is common and familiar to them, and he's going to be addressing their excesses, which there were excesses regarding this as well as everything else that we've been talking about. And so he's going to be confronting the excesses, but then he's going to be looking through the law to its original intent. And he's going to end up saying that just as divorce was a protection that God put into a sinful world because of the hardness of people's hearts, so there had to be occasions for that, he's going to say that the making of vows like were in the Old Testament, that too is a recognition of sin in the world and its allowance because there is sin in the world. And so it's going to be addressing that. But he's going to cut through that and say, but really, if there wasn't sin in the world, all you would need to say was yes or no. And that would be just as certain as anything else. Sometimes in a wedding ceremony, well, we talk about making vows, and they walk through the things that they are committing to doing, but we call them vows, that they are vowing those things. But if there was not sin in the world, they could just simply say, I do, and that's it. That's all they would have to say, and that's the gist that Jesus is driving at here. We'll break this apart and look at it in a little bit more detail, but let's get some of the context regarding what was taking place in their culture. Remember, Jesus is addressing a works-based religious system at that time. Now, it did have its roots in what God provided for them in the Mosaic covenant. But they had steered away from the faith aspect. Faith was throughout the Old Testament, all the way back to Abraham. Abraham had faith, and God counted Abraham's faith as righteousness. He looked and said, that's righteous because you have faith. And that should be the pattern throughout the Old Testament. But what people had done is they had begun to say, no, we're not going to focus on the faith aspect of it. We're going to focus on the works aspect. Now, if our works are what allow us to have good standing before God, we've got to in some way make them keepable. And so they would focus in on making it keepable. So what John Stott in his commentary says regarding those verses that we just looked at from the Old Testament is this: even a superficial reading of these commandments indicates plainly their intention. they prohibit false swearing or perjury, that is, making a vow and then breaking it. But the caustic Pharisees got to work on these awkward prohibitions and tried to restrict them. They shifted people's attentions away from the vow itself and the need to keep it to the formula used in making it. They argued that what the law was really prohibiting was not taking the name of the Lord in vain, but taking the name of the Lord in vain. Now, it's a subtle shift, but it is a shift. The emphasis of the prohibitions in the Old Testament were on making vain promises, empty promises that you weren't going to take into consideration. The formula in the Old Testament that if you were going to take a vow, you would take it in the name of the Lord. And that was the formula that you were supposed to use. So that if you were to make a vow, it is in the name of the Lord, and then if you don't follow through on it, you have taken the Lord's name in vain. So God's emphasis was on the in vain part of it. The Pharisees switched it over to the Lord's name part of it, didn't worry so much about the in vain part of it, and then said, you know what? If we switch the formula, then we're good. So if we take the Lord's name out of it, substitute something else in, then it doesn't matter so much whether you keep it or not. Coming back to Stott's quote here, false swearing, they concluded, meant profanity or a profane use of the divine name, not perjury, which is a dishonest pledging of one's word. So it didn't matter if you pledged your word falsely as long as you didn't drag God into it. If you're just tricking your fellow man, you're okay. But if you drag God's name into it, then that's not so okay. Let's look at a different passage in Matthew that illustrates this point even better than what our Matthew 5:1 does. It's the same emphasis that Jesus is making, but it shows their hypocrisy on taking vows a little bit more clearly. Turn to Matthew 23, verses 16 through 22. Matthew chapter 23, verses 16 through 22. In this passage, Jesus is calling them out, the same group of people here, and he says, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind. For which is greater, the gold in the temple? The gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it. So apparently what was happening in their culture at that day was, as they were parsing the law as closely as they could, they had decided, and I'm sure this didn't happen all in a moment, it grew up to be this over time, and through accepted use, it became thought as an honorable thing to do. They got to the point where they thought, you know what? I can get somebody to do something if I can make a claim that's big enough to get their attention and makes them think of God, but I've actually stopped short of that, and so therefore I don't have to follow through on it. And that's what it's saying. Notice, it says in those first two at least, that they said, if you swear by this object, you really haven't sworn at all. But if you swear by this object, then you have to follow through on it. And so they're parsing things out, and they're going, you know what? If I say, by the temple, I'm going to do this thing, then they'll be thinking, ooh, the temple's pretty close to God. They must be swearing by God, so I must be able to count on them really doing it. And then they don't do it, and they're like, ha! I didn't say by the gold that was in the temple, so I don't have to do it, because the gold was given to God, and so in the temple, the gold is something, but not the temple itself, so you're out, I win. Or they would say, you know what, by the altar, and again, you're thinking the altar is very sanctified. very holy. And so if they say by the altar, then I'm sure they're going to go follow through on what they're doing. They're like, ha, but the altar wasn't given to God. The gift on the altar was given to God. And so therefore, I don't have to do it. And Jesus is saying, foolish, blind. Don't you see that everything is God's? Now, the everything is God's portion comes across more clearly in our Matthew 5, but the hypocrisy comes across in Matthew 23, where they're just looking for ways to deceive. Now, we like to do these things too. I never really got into this much. My parents didn't tolerate lying in our house or anything approaching lying, and so I didn't get into it much, but my friends would oftentimes have a hand behind their back when they were promising to do something. And of course, what were they doing? Crossing their fingers. For some reason, if they were crossing their fingers, they were freed from the promise that they had made. Or if that was too obvious, some of them, and I can't do it in these boots, but some of them would cross their toes. And so if their toes were crossed, you'd have no way of knowing whether their toes were crossed or not. But if they had crossed their toes, then they didn't have to come through with it. That's the sort of thing Jesus is talking about here. That your word should be reliable, and yet we often we want to find ways of getting other people to do what we want them to do where we don't have any skin in the game any longer. And heads I win, tails you lose type situation. That's what they were doing with the vows that they were making at that time. You can come back to Matthew chapter 5 if you want to. We also do it in more business-like ways in the fine print. Now, I don't spend a lot of time reading fine print. I don't know if you've ever been burned by fine print before, but I've heard stories of people who they thought they were agreeing to something, but they didn't read the fine print at the bottom. And that fine print took the whole agreement in a completely different direction that they had no idea they were going in. It's, again, making things look like they're saying one thing when in fact they're saying something very different. And that is what Jesus is calling out here. That's the direction we're going to go with this, but let's first take on how this compares with the Old Testament. Because these sorts of things oftentimes would frustrate me when I'm reading my Bible. It's like, but that looks like it's contradicting something. Is Jesus contradicting the Old Testament? Is he contradicting what was done in the Old Testament? And at first it appears so. Until you understand what it is that Jesus is driving at, it appears that he's contradicting the Old Testament. He's not actually doing that. Instead of contradicting the Old Testament, he's emphasizing God's intent. But the law did sometimes require oaths in the Old Testament. There were some instances in which it actually required it. Exodus 22 verses 10 and 11 would be one example of that. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, or a sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, is hurt, or driven away, no one seeing it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods. And the owner of it shall accept that, and he shall not make it good. A modern application might be, you are going to be taking care of your neighbor's dog or cat while they go on vacation. And they come back, and dog or cat is gone, or dead, or something. And they're like, I want my dog or cat back. You're like, about that. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Your dog or cat isn't here. Now, with things that were more valuable, like they were talking, a sheep or a donkey or an ox, this is like talking about their tractors and talking about their means of living. A donkey might be your pickup truck for bringing your goods to market. An ox might be your tractor for plowing your field. So we're talking about something far more significant than a dog or cat, but we think in terms of pets right now. And they might have actually been secreting it away so that they can expand their flock, that they can make themselves wealthier at the other's expense. Well, this is saying, in an instance where there are no witnesses, nobody knows what happens to that animal, no one can say, then you take the two members and you put an oath between them, and you have them both agree to an oath of the Lord that they did not put their hand to it to benefit themselves. And the one who lost their animal, well, they're going to say, well, if they were willing to say, God is my witness, then so be it. Now, if it was some negligence on the person's part who was taking care of the other animal for them, then they have to repay it in full, because again, that's that person's livelihood that's at stake here. And if it was their negligence, they just weren't doing what they were supposed to, then they need to repay it in full. But if it was just an accident that happened over time, then they just say, I'm sorry, God is my witness. An oath was required in that situation. Or in Numbers chapter 5, verses 19 through 22, I won't read the whole thing, but there's the woman who's accused of being unfaithful in her marriage. And again, women didn't have much standing in that day. And so there was this scenario that was set up whereby she could be tested whether or not she had been unfaithful. And twice it says, the priest shall put her under oath. Verse 19 of Numbers 5 says, the priest shall put her under oath. And verse 21, then the priest shall put the woman under the oath of the curse. Now, an interesting thing about this, because some have wondered, how could any of this actually result in the desired outcome? Some think that the seriousness of putting the woman under oath before the Lord and describing the things that would potentially take place to her body, it would be such a solemn event for her that if she had actually been guilty, she would just own up to it rather than going through to the end of what was taking place. So some think that that's what is taking place here, but regardless of how this all worked, the point is she was put under an oath to the Lord, and it was a command, you will do this. So again, in my mind, is Jesus violating the Old Testament? And the answer still is no. There's a reason that God required that, and that reason is consistent throughout what Jesus is talking in Matthew 5. That the whole reason for needing to use an oath in the first place is there's sin in the world. And there's deception in the world. If there wasn't deception, there wouldn't be the need to use the oath. So live in a way that you're not deceiving anyone when you don't have to do it. God himself sometimes employed oaths in the Old Testament. One example from the Old Testament, one example of the New Testament that explains it is Genesis 22, verses 16 and 17. God says, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord. In other words, he's taking his own name and applying it to an oath that he's making. He says, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessing, I will bless you. And multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. What's going on here? I mean, God has never been engaged in any deception. Why would God apply his own name to an oath? Why would he do that? Well, Hebrews 6:13 gives us a hint in that direction when it says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. So he's setting the bar at the very highest. What is he doing when he's doing all that, though? Well, what he's doing is not to increase his credibility. He doesn't need to increase his credibility like we would, because we've been known to lie. He doesn't have to increase his credibility. Instead, what he's doing, and I'm quoting from Stott again here, he's eliciting and confirming our faith. The fault which made God condescend to this human level lay not in any untrustworthiness of his, but in our unbelief. We tend to be very skeptical. Yeah, John?
Well, when God said that to Abraham, he could carry it out. When we make an agreement, we can't always carry it out because it depends on the Lord. So there's a lot of factors that could prohibit us or that would cause us not to be able to follow through on the oath.
Yeah. Example from Good News Club again yesterday. I love kids. They give so many examples. But one of the first places that kids learn that promises are not airtight, and just because someone promised something doesn't mean it's going to happen, happens when parents promise something that then turns out to be out of their control. So one of the girls raised her hand when we were talking about, has anyone ever lied to you? And she said, well, one time my parents promised to take us to a park the next day, but then it rained and they didn't take us. I was like, not exactly a lie. They couldn't really help that, could they? But to John's point, God can always control all the circumstances, and so when he promises, it actually happens. I try to tell my kids plans are made to be changed because so often our plans are. We can do one of two things here. Either we can tell you nothing in advance, and just you're constantly, life's a complete surprise to you, or we'll tell you this is what we're shooting at, but who knows if we're actually going to get there or not. Those are the two options that we have on ours. But nevertheless, God can. But the reason that he does it here isn't so much because he's going to perform it in that way. It's he wants the listener to give the gravest attention to what he has said, the most solemn attention to what he has said. When the Lord says, I am by myself promising this, he's using the very highest in the creation, but he's going to that level because he wants to say, listen up, this will happen, and he knows that we'll pay more attention to that. We are accustomed to being skeptical of all promises. Our parents couldn't follow through on many of their promises that they made to us when we were little. Our teachers couldn't follow through on some of the promises that they made, no matter how hard they wanted to. They don't remember everything, and certainly they don't remember everything in the same way that the children remember it. The children remember it in one way, the teacher remembers it in the other way. So sometimes the promises that weren't fulfilled were just because the child imagined that those words meant something different. But still, the teachers fall flat. And then we get to be adults and we find that our employers don't follow through on all their promises. Our politicians follow through on very few of their promises. And on down the line. And we're like, so a promise is really nothing. And so we're looking for somebody to up the ante. Okay, I heard those words. What are you going to do to prove it to me? When you go to the bank to get a loan, and they're like, you're a nice person, I'll just give you all this money, right? They want some proof that you're actually going to follow through on what they said. They want to know that they're at least covering some of their loss if you don't come through on what you're saying. And so that's what this is driving at. He doesn't have to increase his fidelity. He won't be more faithful by using his own name, but we'll pay better attention to it. It's also important when we're thinking about Matthew 5, verses 33 and following, when we see Jesus say, do not swear at all, that he's not actually giving an absolute prohibition. And I know that because he doesn't go through the rest of his ministry under that same rule. Now, he's emphasizing and underscoring a point here, but neither he nor his followers went through the rest of the New Testament without swearing an oath. So we know that he doesn't mean that in particular, but the reason that I emphasize this is there are people still today who will look at this verse and trying to take Jesus at his word, they will say, I will not in a court of law swear an oath. If you try to put me under oath in a courtroom, I have to be a conscious objector to that because Jesus said, do not swear an oath. Well, we find that that's not what Jesus was meaning here. Matthew 26, verses 62 through 64, you don't have to turn there. But the high priest arose and said to him, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him. Jesus answered when the priest put him under oath. He wasn't answering before, but once he was put under oath, the oath of the living God, then he really did answer him. And so Jesus is demonstrating that it's not, he doesn't expect that there will never be a time in your life that you take an oath. And so that's not the point of the passage here. I could just say that Paul did something similar. In 2 Corinthians 1:23, Paul says, moreover, I call God as witness against my soul that to spare you I came no more to Corinth. Paul is making an oath there. It's the same formula that he's talking about. Galatians 1:20, now concerning the things which I write to you, indeed, before God I do not lie. Jesus oftentimes in his ministry also intensified what he was saying by saying, truly, truly, I say to you. Now, it's not like he's been lying all the way up until that point, but all of a sudden he's like, you know what? This one's too important to pull your leg on. And so this one, you really need to pay attention to because it's going to happen. What he's doing is saying truly, truly, so that you'll pay attention to it. You'll listen to it more closely, and that's what he's doing. It's not, in that case, taking an oath, but what it's doing is underscoring. But notice in all of these instances that we've referenced here, whether from Jesus' own example or from Paul's example or others throughout the New Testament, the point is we live in a sinful world where we expect people to lie to us. And we expect that the truth isn't going to happen. And Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5, if you are going to be my disciple, you don't need to up the ante on what you're saying. If you say yes, it means yes. If you say no, it means no. Do not go back on your word. A follower of Jesus Christ must be trustworthy in what they say. They must follow through on what they say. And so Jesus' prohibition reemphasizes God's intention. Going to lay a little bit more foundation for God's intention here before I truly, let's do it this way. So what I've been saying here is, we've hammered it in. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Jesus is not contradicting that verse 33. That was given to people because they live in a sinful world in which people do go back on their word. But what Jesus expects from his followers comes next. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. What Jesus is doing here is he's breaking it down into a couple of different segments. The first is, if we try to parse out the command to not speak falsely and say, you know what, there are levels here. And so if I was to swear by the chair, then I need a 25% follow through on what I've said. But if I was to swear by the computer, which is the sound system, which is more valuable than the chair, then I need to go up to 50%. If I was to swear by the whole building, then I would need to go up to 75%. But if I swear by the people who are made in the image of God, then I have to go up to 100%. And we were to set it out that way, we would be doing similar to what people were doing in Jesus' day. But Jesus is saying here that the earth and everything in it is all God's. And so you can't swear by anything without getting back to the God who made it. Let's work through this real quick. Notice the instances that he says. So you don't swear in verse 34 by heaven, for it's God's throne. And they might be like, you know what, that's a good point. That's pretty close to God. I can see that that's God's habitation. I won't swear by heaven, or I'll understand that if I swear by heaven, yeah, that's pretty close. I'm basically swearing by God. So be it. But let's get some distance here. And Jesus says, no, not by earth either. For it is his footstool. There he's quoting from the Psalms. The earth, God's still here. Psalm 139 would say, where in all the earth can I go from your presence? I can't. Nowhere in earth, nowhere in the universe can I get away from God's presence. They're like, okay, I'll give you that one. I can think of that psalm that talks about the earth being God's footstool. I'll give you that one. But what about one part of the earth? And he says, nor by Jerusalem, for it is a city of the great king. If we were to try to substitute another city in here, we wouldn't get much farther, because Paul says in Acts that God knows all the people and sets their boundaries, the boundaries of their habitation. So that one article that I read recently could say, you know what? When you are looking to move from one place to another, the same God that sets the boundaries for whole nations and sets their habitation, he also determined who was going to be on the street that you're moving to, because they need to be in proximity to you, and you need to be in proximity to them. God has set all of those things. So he's choosing Jerusalem, which we know is the holy city. We know it bears God's name specially, but we couldn't substitute another city in here and get away from it. Well, what about one part of that city? He's trying to boil it down here. He says, You know what? Let's skip all the way to the end here, Jesus is saying. What if you just say, by my head? I mean, my head's what it is. It's all that it is. It's just one little tiny microscopic speck on this vast globe when you picture the globe as an entirety, or just one individual out of a whole city. I know I'm not that much. Maybe I can just swear by my head, and that's good enough. And just like, tried to change your hair color lately without dyeing it? He's like, can you, by thinking, make one hair white or black? And all of our hair are moving in the direction of lighter. We're all getting lighter, and those of us that are guys are getting lesser. And that's the direction we're all going. Just like, if you can't even control how many hairs you have and what color they are without having to put some sort of dye on it, who's doing that? You're not doing it. Think maybe God has something to say about that? Doesn't it say somewhere that God has the very number of your hairs counted on your head? You can't go to the most insignificant detail anywhere on earth and say, God has no part of that, so therefore I can swear by that, and I'm not dragging God's name into it. Jesus is saying, it is all important. You can't get away from any of it. So then, if you can't, don't try to up the ante of your speech so that people will believe you. Instead, follow through on it. Now, let me back up a little bit, having walked through that far, and talk about God's perspective on honesty. God expects people to speak the truth. Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19. He's going to use a formula, I believe, actually it was a different study I was doing that talked about the 6, yea, 7. It's a feature in Proverbs that is used regularly to get your attention. And so the author of Proverbs is saying, these 6 things the Lord hates, and then, 7 are an abomination to him. But out of those 7, listen to the ones that have to do with honesty. A proud look, a lying tongue, number 2. Hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift to running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. That discord isn't necessarily lying, but oftentimes it is the result of lying or exaggeration that's taking place that sows the discord. So about 2.5 out of the 7 have specifically to do with lying and deceit. And these are the things that the Lord hates, yea, that are an abomination to him. I think God makes his feelings pretty clear, but let's not leave it there. Proverbs 12:22 say, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. There are your 2 options. If you think of something, the worst thing that you could possibly think of cleaning up, the thing that you absolutely never want to clean up again in your life, or hope that you never do ever have to clean up, that's how God feels about your lying lips. Or think about that thing that maybe you like to eat it, maybe you like to look at it. It's just like, wow. That's how he feels about truth. Because God is a God of truth. And so where there's truth, there is his delight. Where there are lies, it's like, oh, what comes out of your lips when you ate something that disagrees with you, that's an abomination. That's how God feels toward the lying lips. Psalm 119, 163 tells how we who love God should feel about it. I hate and abhor lying, but I love your law. God's pretty clear. He wants honesty. And Jesus is saying this is the intention from the beginning. So God expects people to speak the truth. The second half of this that goes along with what Jesus is saying is that God expects people to keep their word. It's not just saying the truth, it's following through and keeping it that Jesus is talking about. That's why he's saying, let your yes be yes and your no, no. If it's yes, then don't just say the yes, make it yes. And if it's no, don't just say the no, make it no. Leviticus 5 verses 4 through 6 gives some Old Testament case law that talks about this, where it says, if a person swears, and by swearing, that's not what we would think of as swearing, profane speech. That's not what it's talking about. It's they make a promise with an oath speaking thoughtlessly with his lips, to do evil or to do good, whatever it is that a man may pronounce by oath, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty in any of these matters. In other words, you said it. You can count on me, I'll be there. And it slips your mind. And all of a sudden it's like, it's such and such time. I have a feeling I was supposed to be doing something. And it comes to mind, pling. It says, that's sin. And it shall be when he is guilty in any of these matters that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed. By the way, a trespass there is a solid boundary there. And you must not go across that line, but you have gone across that line. And you're like, it's just a slip of the mind. God's saying, this is trespass. You have promised a thing, and you didn't follow through on it. That is sin. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb, or a kid of the goats as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. Slip of the mind. No, it's not a slip of the mind. When you say yes, make it yes. When you say no, make it no. Psalm 15:4, almost done here. Regarding that, I forgot is not an acceptable excuse before God. But regarding Psalm 15:4, the question is, who will ascend up to the hill of the Lord? In verse 1. And then it gives a list. These are the sorts of people that God will accept into his presence. Same sort that Jesus is going to be talking about in Matthew 5, but Psalm 15:4 says, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. Sometimes when we make a promise to do something, we didn't think through all the ramifications of that. And once we find out the full scope, it's like, ouch. I'm not sure if I can do that. And this is saying a person who fears the Lord, when they say, I'm going to do this, even if the bill is much greater than they expected it was going to be, if they said they were going to do it, they will follow through and do it. These are the ideas that are underlying what Jesus says here. So with the simple words in the law, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall not bear false witness. Jesus is saying this is a whole lot more than just the formula of the oath that you put together. As though if we swear on a stack of Bibles, we actually have to do it. But if we just say, yeah, I'll be there, then it doesn't matter. Jesus is saying, no. The swearing on a stack of Bibles and the saying, yes, I'll be there, those are the same deal. Because God expects truth to come out of our lips. He hates lying, he hates deception, he honors truth. And Jesus' followers ought to be people of truth because they follow a God who is a God of truth. That's what he's driving at here. Any thoughts?
Right here.
Yeah.
Where does pledge allegiance to the flag, the America, the Republic, and bringing God's name in? How does that fall into the mix?
Sure. So where it falls in is it is acceptable to do in a situation like that. Now, it originates because there is evil in the world. That's the very last statement that Jesus makes in verse 37. For whatever is more than these is of the evil one. The reason that we have to pledge like that, one nation under God, well, if it wasn't for evil in this world, every nation would be under God, and then we wouldn't need to say it. But because there is evil in this world, it's okay in some circumstances to use that formula. Again, the New Testament writers did when it was something that was very solemn, especially in a civil setting, like a courtroom setting. Jesus answered under oath, Paul answered under oath, and at times where they really needed to underscore a point, not because they were trying to deceive their readers, but because their readers really needed to pay attention to it. There are settings where it's okay to do that, but what his point here is our integrity ought to be such that we would follow through whether or not we said that. Make sense? Hopefully I didn't use so many words that I clouded that answer.
With that example,
So maybe the pledge, are you saying, is it more the words "I pledge" that you're wondering if that's acceptable to do?
Oh, because it's an agreement, I've heard, people in the church that wouldn't want to, pledge allegiance to the flag in the, United States of America because they don't make a pledge to anything other than God.
Yeah. I'd say that's a matter of conscience, whether or not you pledge to anything other than God. I do think that God put us into a nation, and he said, honor to whom honor is due. There was honor to specific rulers there, and Paul used his Roman citizenship when it was appropriate. He didn't always play the Roman citizenship card when he could have, but he played it at appropriate times. And so I think there is evidence in Scripture that it is proper, and I would say the Pledge of Allegiance is proper honor to be given to our country. Where I would say crosses a line, and I never considered this when I was growing up, because from little on I was in the Awana clubs, and so, I mean, I just didn't think about what we did in the Awana clubs. And I was accustomed to pledging to the Christian flag as well as the American flag, and pledging to the Bible as well. So the Awana clubs had a pledge as well. I pledge allegiance to the Awana flag, which stands for the Awana clubs, whose goal is to reach boys and girls with the gospel of Christ and train them to serve him. Now, I don't have any problem with any part of that statement, but other than the pledge at the beginning, and a veteran pointed it out. He's like, is it right for us to be pledging to the Awana flag? This is just an organization. Really? Should we really be elevating that to the same level as the American flag and the Christian flag and the Bible? I was like, he's got a point there. I think that the words "I pledge" should not go in there. It's good to have a club that wants to reach boys and girls with the gospel of Christ and train them to serve him, but do I really pledge my life to that club? Probably not. And so that would be an instance in which those words, regardless of how much of an oath they are probably misplaced. They are misplaced.
Well, I could see, like the people that joined the military in World War II, you could see they had a clear reason to join. It wasn't so muddy, you know.
Right.
So their pledge, I think their pledge means a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those who have been in the military, they know on a level that those of us who are just civilians don't know what really goes into that pledge and what really makes this nation great. The greatest patriots that I have known in my lifetime are, well, they're men. I haven't known many women who have served, but so they are men who have served for our country, and they are patriotic. They know what it takes to preserve this nation, and they don't want it trampled. And so I would agree. Yeah, so again, in a courtroom setting, it's appropriate, according to the pattern of the New Testament, for there to be solemnity, because to deceive on that level where matters of justice are there, I mean, that is a travesty. It's also a travesty in all the rest of life, which is Jesus' point, but it is important in a courtroom setting to get people to actually stop and think, whoa, this is important. And so that's what it does. It is of the evil one, because there's evil in the world, and so we need times to stop and think, you know what I say here? It's really important. It would be perjury in this instance for me to get it wrong. I should probably make sure my facts are straight before I talk. I have a tendency to, on medical forms, just go, I don't remember that. Away I go. It's not that, I'm not trying to be dishonest, but it's just not worth it to me to look up to find out all these questions. It just really isn't. So I feel bad for any doctors who are reading that stuff, because, yeah, all these people are cringing over here, as they should be. But handing me a medical form, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give it a lot of, it's not that I'm intentionally deceiving. However, in a courtroom setting, you don't want people just going, yeah, it was that guy for sure. I mean, wait, was it even that day? No, never mind. I don't know. You don't want people speaking in courtroom setting like that, so it's okay to have an oath to get them to think clearly. All right? Derailing here. Let's go ahead and pray and be out of here. Dear Heavenly Father, we sympathize with James when he says that there are so many things that are large in this world that can be controlled, and you've given us the wisdom to control them. These mighty ships that we get to see on the Great Lakes here, carrying their tons and tons of cargo, they're controllable. The largest animals, they're controllable, but our tongues so often are not. We ask for your help. This is a high calling that Jesus has given, that we would be truthful in what we say, that people would be able to count on us when we have made a statement, that it really is going to happen the way that we said, and that we will back it. We know that left to ourselves, we will fall flat on our faces here. This is another instance in which we need a great Savior, because we are great sinners. But we ask for your help, that you would allow us to live up to this high calling that you've given. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.